Hey everybody, my name is Paul Vojchehoske. I'm the director of Randall School of Real Estate, and this is video 6, a continuing video series on our 6-hour professionalism class. Good news is I think I'm going to have one more video and then we'll be done with the videos here. So anyways, we are in your booklet on page 32. We're going to talk about misrepresentation and concealment in real estate. And honestly, this is a big issue. Many times it's unintentional. The agent gets drawn in to a lawsuit between the buyer and the seller. And that the reason for that is because typically when one party sues the other, they will sue everybody involved in the transaction, both brokers, both agents, the inspector, everybody. And then they let the judge throw out the parties that convince the judge they shouldn't be involved in the lawsuit. Typically, though, the agent and the broker is always involved. And a lot of it has to do with misrepresentation or a concealment of a fact. Now, there are different types of misrepresentation, and they all have a different outcome, and we have to know them. The first one is on your screen there, and you have to know this. So please, on page 32, intentional misrepresentation, please highlight this. Intentional misrepresentation occurs when someone purposely or intentionally, if you will, misled another to ensure that the transaction moves forward. They intentionally give them false information. Let me give you an example, a real live one. So the agent or the seller, either one can do this. But in this particular case, an agent had a house for sale, listed for sale, and a buyer called and said, hey, I went through your open house last Sunday. We're really interested, but the roof concerns us. We don't want to we have to replace a roof in a couple years after buying it. How old's the roof? So the agent said, well, the roof is like 4 or 5 years old, so it's a newer roof, when in fact it was really 25 years old. And the agent did that to keep the transaction moving forward, to hopefully get some type of an offer. Now, another scenario could have been the agent doesn't know, goes to the seller, and the seller says, yes, the roof is 5 years old, knowing that it's 25 years old. So the agent, yes, passes on wrong information, but they didn't intentionally do it. It was innocent misrepresentation. But on the part of the seller, it was intentional misrepresentation. Okay, so keep that in mind. It occurs when there was an intent to deceive. That's the key. The next type is negligent, and this kind of goes down to if you didn't know, you should have known. I'll give you an example of another real life scenario. Had a seller who totally remodeled a basement. And the seller, before putting the for sale sign in the yard and signing the listing contract out, asked the listing agent whether or not he should have pulled a permit for the basement. The agent said no. And so they put the house up on the market. The seller or the buyer came along. They purchased the property. And then the city found out about a year after closing, and they basically nailed the new owner. The new owner said, well, I didn't do it. It was the previous owner. So then the buyer sued the seller for misrepresentation. And then the seller sued the agent going, well, listen, you said I didn't need a permit. And the agent tried to say, well, yeah, but you know what? That was you had the obligation to find that out. I really thought it was true. Well, the agent lost because you have a duty. You're in the real estate business. Dealing with clients that remodel their basements is a common occurrence. So it's even if you didn't know, you should have known. That's a tort law principle. Even if you didn't know, because you're a real estate professional and because people remodel their houses all the time, you should have known that in Omaha it's required for the seller to pull a permit. So therefore, that's called negligent misrepresentation, okay? The next one is innocent misrepresentation. That happens when one that has induced a party to a contract had reasonable grounds for believing that it was true at the time the representation was made, but it wasn't true. Again, going back to our original scenario. So the buyer asked the listing agent how old the roof is, and the listing agent goes to the seller. The seller says it's 5 years, knowing it's 25 years old, but they tell the listing agent it's 5 years old, and the listing agent passes that information on. Right? They had no That's innocent misrepresentation, because the fact that the information was incorrect is true, but there was no intent and they had no duty to know. Okay. Now, unlike the permit scenario where they do have a duty, in this scenario, every expectation is the seller should know, and they got the information from the seller. That is innocent misrepresentation. So what is concealment? Concealment is the act of refraining from disclosure, especially an act which prevents or hinders the discovery of something or a cover-up. And this is alleged all the time, whether there was concealment or not. But I will tell you, I was involved professionally, not me being sued, but in a capacity of advising a client one time, where it was up by a small town north of Omaha, in the town's called Tacoma, where it was evident, and of course the buyer found out after closing, but it was evident that they covered up underground storage tanks, which is a big no-no, right? And it was obvious that they did, and their intent was to cover up. Now, that can lead to fraud, certainly, but definitely that's the definition of concealment. You conceal an adverse material fact, so in the hopes that no one will find it. Okay? All right. Claims against real estate agents. The top claims. This changes every year. It's kind of cool to watch, but basically this comes from the legal reporters, like companies like Westlaw, that track these statistics. And what were the top claims against agents? Well, the first one, the top one, is real estate fraud. That's a broad definition, and every state has a different definition, but it's when agents, they breach their duty and they lie about things. That was the top. You have to know that. So make sure on page 32, under top claims against real estate agents in your book, you highlight real estate fraud. Contract violations is another one. Another one is damage to the property. All right. Disputes over escrow payments and down payments and so forth. You can read it there in your book. But those are the top ones that lead to lawsuits. And every one of these almost are always preventable, but it goes back to a couple of things. Anytime there's a claim against a real estate agent, most of the time, it's a result of the agent who was just shady and really was trying to get the closing done. It was all about the commission. And there was some negligence or intentional misrepresentation type stuff, or doing things that wasn't ethical or illegal, or they should have had knowledge about something and didn't, or it's laziness. They just didn't want to get a form signed. So, hey, everything was done by text or verbal when it should have been put in writing or put in an email or something like that. Most of these claims, for the most part, are avoidable if you adhere to the processes. That's usually the problem. All right. If you go and look at page 32, 33, 34, and 35, these are different scenarios, real live situations, again, that I think it would be very beneficial if you went through and you read through these, and then kind of, well, how would you handle these? I know, again, you don't have a whole lot of experience, but they are fun to think about. Avoiding misrepresentation, that's something that we need to talk about here. And let me get to the right slide here. We're on page 35 in your book. All right. Avoiding misrepresentation. How can we avoid misrepresentation? Well, there are some things that we can do as agents, and they are listed on page 35. The first one is visually inspect the property, and you need to highlight that. It's not okay for you to just send an agent over or send a client over, a buyer, to a house that's for sale because it's vacant, and say, hey, look around, and if you're interested, we'll write up a deal. You need to make sure that you and your client visually inspect the property. And then it is a duty of yours, if you see something in plain view that looks out of sight, to point it out. So, for example, if you look at the roof and you say, man, that roof is suspect, don't tell them the roof is bad. But just say, hey, listen, I'm suspect about the roof. I recommend we get a roof inspection by a contractor or a home inspector, something to that effect. The other thing that's very important, and especially in today's market as of the time of this video, it's not uncommon in certain price ranges to have, 5, 10 offers in on a home. And so many times Agents are writing up offers for buyers who have never even set foot on the property. And when you do that, you have to protect yourself. Write those contingencies in your contract. Things like the buyer and seller are aware that the buyer is buying this property sight unseen. That's important to do. So therefore, you're relinquishing that liability back on the buyer and not you. So to avoid misrepresentations, visually inspect the property. That's important. The next one is note and respond to any inspection red flags. So if you do have an inspection, point those out. Sit down with your buyer and say, hey, here's the inspection report, and here are the things that they indicated. Which ones would you like me to ask to be repaired, if any? All right, the next one, have a property condition report written and signed by the seller. In Nebraska, we call it the seller property condition disclosure. That's where they have to answer a whole, 4 pages of questions about the material condition of the property. Disclose all defects on the property to the buyers if you know about them, right? If you know that the foundation is leaking. Let me give you a different scenario. Remember we talked about back in agency, I think it was video number 3, where you had the property listed for sale and they were going through a divorce. Confidential information, and you can't disclose that. It was on the market for 30 days. You didn't sell it. It expired. They listed it with a different agent. So then you have a buyer 2 months later that's interested in that. Obviously, we said you can't disclose the reason they're moving because that's confidential information, and that is correct. But let's use the same scenario, except the reason the deal fell apart. So you had the house listed. You had an offer come in. They had a home inspection. Home inspection indicated that the foundation is bad. Structural engineer came out and said, yep, the whole foundation needs to be replaced. The seller said, I'm not doing it. You lost the listing. Another agent comes along and lists it for sale. 2 months later, you have a buyer that's interested in it. Do you disclose what you know? And that is that the foundation is bad. And the answer is yes. That's not confidential information. Adverse material facts about the material condition of the property is absolutely disclosable. In fact, if you have that property listed, you're the listing agent, and you find out that the foundation is bad, and the seller says, I instruct you. Remember, one of the fiduciary duties is obedience. I instruct you. You must obey. Do not disclose this. Well, that's an unlawful request. You must disclose it, even if the seller does not, or the seller lies about it on the disclosure. Okay? You must disclose all defects of the property to the buyer that you know about. And that is true even if they are a customer and you don't represent them. Exercise reasonable care throughout the transaction. Act like a professional. That's so important. Think before you respond to questions. I cannot overemphasize that. We are so in tune to sell, and the small talk and everything. If somebody asks you a question and you don't know the answer, don't lie. Say, honestly, I don't know. That's a great question. I will find the answer out and get back to you. Reveal fact, not what you think. That is true most of the time, but I do think there is room to give your opinion on things. Not about a future value of a house or whatever, but let's say, for example, right now the trend is everything gray and white in the interior. And somebody says, hey, Paul, you're a bit in real estate. Do you think gray and white's going to be around forever? Well, I think I can reasonably say, trends change. Remember when olive green and harvest gold was the in thing in the 70s? Well, you probably don't remember, but it's true. And bell bottoms, well, all of those trends, they didn't last. My guess is this won't last, and at some point you're going to have to update your colors. I think that's perfectly appropriate, right? On the other hand, if they ask you, hey, do you think my house is going to be more valuable 10 years from now? That's something you don't want. That's a road you don't want to go down. Okay? Confirm discussions and decisions with written documentation. Oh, thank you very much, Carol, for putting that in here. We are so time constrained in our business. And I mean this sincerely. A halfway busy real estate agent can put in 18 to 20 hour days sometimes. And we just want the deal done. We want to help our client, but we don't transcribe things into writing. Please get the important decisions and answers in writing. Even if it's a text or email at a minimum, but something in writing where you can verify who it came from. Please, that would save so many lawsuits. Maintain complete and accurate files. Don't assume your broker is going to maintain those files, even though they're required to for 5 years under Nebraska law. You should have your own ghost file that you maintain for 7 years. That's my recommendation. 7 to 10 years, because I want that file in case I get audited and the auditor from the IRS says, well, prove to me that you claimed all these miles on this house at 123 Main Street. How do I know you had it for sale? I can pull the file and say, here, see, 123 Main Street in 2012 that you're auditing me about. Yep, I did have it listed. And you never know when you're going to get sued. So, all right, that is misrepresentation and how to avoid it. Next video, we're going to move on to professionalism in the industry. And quite frankly, as I'm looking at this, I think maybe that might be the last video, but we'll find out. I'll see you in the next video.